Flameo Hotman, Netflix live-action Avatar The Last Airbender definitely had a lot of epic moments, but it also had some maybe slightly confusing moments thrown in as well. So I'm going to do a full comparison of each episode with the animation in a series of videos. Today we're comparing episode 1. Also, just for clarity, I'm making this because it's interesting to see what the similarities and differences are, and actually it helps explain some of what's going on in the live action. You might even realise that they've included more from the original animation than you first thought when you watched this video. So strap yourselves in, because we're going to get stuck into the details, and as we do, please also consider liking and subscribing. We're on a mission to grow the channel, and I could do with your help. So let's get into it. The opening scene in the live action is of course new. This earthbender isn't in the animation. He's stealing plans for the Fire Nation attack, and he's then taken to Fire Lord Sozin once he's captured, but he's able to get the plans out to the Earth King. Unfortunately for him though, it's all a ruse by Fire Lord Sozin. Now none of that part's actually in the animation. However, it is common knowledge that Fire Lord Sozin did have the plan to attack the air nomads, so this is kind of just bringing that to life. It then goes into the classic intro. The backgrounds you will notice are different. They've tried to liken them to the location and the bending that they represent. It's some random waterbender in this live action. I don't think it's Kuruk like some people have been saying online, but it is a little hard to see the face, so feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. In the animation, of course, it's Master Parku. The Earthbender, on the other hand, does look very similar between both the animation and the live action. Some fun trivia for you: according to the original creators, the Earthbender in the animation's intro was actually the initial design for Toph, because Toph was going to be a bulky male, but obviously later they changed that. But they decided to keep around the model to use in the intro. Now the Firebender in the animation is Azula. I can't quite tell if it is Azula in the live action. It kind of looks like her, so I'm guessing it is. For all the people complaining about Azula's blue fire, ironically the original intro did have Azula bending normal red or orange fire. So maybe season 1 live action Azula isn't so inaccurate after all. Finally, the Airbender, they gender switched it from a male air nomad to a female air nomad. Again, some people were saying this is Yong Chen. I don't think it is, I think it's just a generic female airbender. The voiceover words are the same though, in the same sequence as the Avatar cycle, which is exactly how it was in the animation. The next scene you see the iconic map, it's just a more vibrant map of what you saw in the animation. It then goes on to show Avatar Kyoshi as the voiceover explains that the 4 nations lived in harmony, and it goes into a bit more detail about the Avatar, how the Avatar keeps the peace, and also how the Avatar's the only one that can master all 4 elements. The themes here are similar, even though the words themselves aren't the same. The context of how it's been told is also a little bit different. It's not Katara doing the voiceover like in the animation, so it doesn't start with the iconic phrase, "My grandmother used to tell me stories." It does go into a bit more detail about the Avatar's cycle though, and you even get to see the line of past Avatars, which I thought was a nice touch. We then get to see the classic Fire Nation attacking scene with those rows of Fire Nation soldiers. It makes it a little more about Sozin though this time compared to the animation, but the visuals themselves are very similar. It also targets the start where Sozin is about to attack the air nomads. And it also reveals that the Avatar is an air nomad who might not be ready to accept his responsibility, which you will notice is a running theme through season 1. However, this does differ slightly to the animation because the phrasing is more around the Avatar disappearing, or vanishing as they talk about, which keep that in your mind because we'll hear more about that later. It's also worth noting that it misses out the Katara and Sokka backstory part, the bit about their father leaving and Katara still having hope that the Avatar's alive and that he can help them win the war. But there's a bunch of new scenes later which you might understand why they cut this piece out. Next, we can go to a set of new scenes, and this might actually explain the little bit about why they were focusing on Sozin earlier, and also why they mentioned it was an airbender. It jumps to the Southern Air Temple and it shows Aang. Now these scenes are actually loosely based on some flashback scenes which come later on in season 1 of the animation. We see in this live action, it does show parts before Aang knows he's the Avatar. In the animation, the council reveal Aang is the Avatar together, but in the live action you can see the council meet with Gyatso first, and then Gyatso reveals it to Aang when they're both alone together. Another thing you'll notice in the live action is that they don't really explain how they know Aang is the Avatar, but in the animation they do explain it, and it's because the signs were clear when Aang chose certain toys to play with, which happened to be the Avatar relics from past Avatars. In the live action during the council meeting, you'll see Gyatso tells them a few things that Aang needs to learn, and if they send him away before he learns those things, he could fail to be everything they need him to be, which does tie in a little bit with how Gyatso phrased his wording around Aang in the animation. So that's something both animated and live action Gyatso kind of align on in terms of how they phrase things to Aang. One thing the live action does get correct about Aang is that he's the youngest Airbender master to receive those tattoos, which aligns correctly between the live action and the animation. They did tweak the type of guidance Gyatso gives Aang though. In the live action, Gyatso's instructions are trying to make Aang come to terms with him being the Avatar, but he also advises him that he has to go away to learn the other disciplines, as the council told him. If you compare that to the animation Gyatso was more telling Aang that he wishes they had waited till he was old enough, but when Aang is old enough, he'll be able to learn more information about being the Avatar by going into the Air Temple Sanctuary, and there would be someone there to guide him. And also the reason they were sending him away in the animated series wasn't necessarily to learn the other disciplines straight away. They were simply going to send him to the Eastern Air Temple because they felt Gyatso had gotten too close to him. Now in terms of the Air Temple Sanctuary, we don't see that in the live action. Instead, you see this hallway here with a Yongchen monument. One fun moment missed out from the animation that the live action just didn't include is pie bending. This was kind of a light-hearted moment that probably doesn't translate well into a live action, but is still quite an iconic moment between Aang and Gyatso. The live action also misses out on showing Aang not fitting in with the other kids after he finds out he's the Avatar. Although having said that, if you listen carefully when Aang's having a heart-to-heart with Appa, he does mention that the other kids say he's lucky for the things he can do, which kind of implies what the animation showed. The live action doesn't show the pie show game between Aang and Gyatso, although again, there is a little later reference to that when we see Gyatso in the spirit world. A nice little detail the live action did capture is Sozin's comet in the sky. The animation was set more during the day, until Aang went underwater, and therefore it didn't really show Sozin's comet. One other thing I thought I would say is this wasn't in the animation, but I really liked in the live action how close Aang and Appa were, especially that hug they had before they decided to run away. Following that, we then get to see the Fire Nation attacking the Southern Air Temple. Again, this whole air nomad genocide stuff was not shown in the animation, although I do believe they had mapped out some scenes for it, and apparently it was cut from the show, obviously because it's a kids show, and they felt it was just a bit too brutal. Having said that, the live action you can see definitely does capture a lot of those brutal moments, and seeing so many airbenders getting roasted alive, that's definitely a lot more grown up than the kids show was. One other thing I thought I would point out about Gyatso and Aang is the live action has Gyatso going into the big room with the kids and then calling out "where's Aang" when he doesn't see Aang. That's slightly different to the animation because Gyatso in the animation actually goes to Aang's room way before the Fire Nation attack. But the significant part for me is that when Gyatso goes to the room, he actually goes to tell Aang to not worry because he says he's not going to let them take Aang away from him. That's not something he does in the live action, which personally I feel is a bit of a miss. Now the air nomad genocide stuff is all going on while Aang is also travelling with Appa. Now the Aang and Appa underwater part, you'll notice the live action is actually very similar to the animation, almost identical in fact. Everything from that wave pushing them under the water, to the way Aang triggers the avatar state and builds out that sphere. The main difference is the live action's kind of doing this flashback at the start of the episode, whereas the animation actually waits until Sokka and Katara have found Aang and they're travelling back to the Southern Water Tribe together. Following that, we then jump forward 100 years. You see Katara practicing waterbending. This has a little element of the animation where Katara's trying to waterbend, but in the animation she's doing it within the fishing boat next to Sokka, compared to this live action where she's doing it on her own. We then see Sokka talking to some kids, kind of like they're soldiers. This is very similar to the animation, although the scene in the animation, like we've said before, comes a little bit later after they've found Aang and brought him back to the village. It then goes on to show Sokka and Katara in the fishing boat. Now before we talk about the fishing boat part, keep a lookout in the background. You can see those otter penguins. It's a nice little Easter egg to the penguin sledding that Aang and Katara went on back in the animation. They don't actually do the whole penguin sledding or really anything about penguins in the live action, but at least there's that little Easter egg there. As part of this scene though, you see Sokka and Katara getting pulled towards a slipstream in their boat, which again is very similar to the animation. And like the animation, they end up crashing on an ice shelf. The boat doesn't wander too far. Another noticeable difference is that Aang's ice sphere is already out, compared to the animation where it rises out of the water when Katara's having an argument with Sokka. You'll see in the live action it flashes to Zuko's boat for a second, which again isn't in the animation, before jumping back to Katara attempting to waterbend the boat back to them, and this is then when Aang's sphere cracks. Again, a little bit different to the animation because Katara has to physically smash open the sphere with Sokka's club. As she's waterbending though, you do see Zuko's ship again with the avatar relics glowing. It then shoots out that iconic blue beam. It then jumps to Zuko in a very similar way, although instead of him saying to his uncle, "Do you know what this means?" he simply says, "Finally," which in fairness kind of summarizes the whole conversation Zuko had in the animation with his uncle anyway. Following that, we see Aang stepping out of the ice sphere, and the way it happens with all the lighting, to be fair, isn't far off the animation, and I thought they did this part quite well. The main difference here is that he remains unconscious in the live action, compared to the animation where he wakes up and gives us one of the greatest pickup lines of all time. He gets Katara to come close, and then he says, "Will you go penguin sledding with me?" We then see Katara and Sokka taking Aang back with them to the village on the boat, compared to the animation where Aang himself takes Katara and Sokka back to their village on Upper. Sadly though, in the live action, they actually leave poor Upper behind. Because of this, we don't get the classic line from Sokka, "And this is my flying sister." Once they're back in the Southern Water Tribe, it's Gran that reveals Aang is an airbender, as opposed to the animation where Katara says it when he goes flying 10 feet in the air. It then jumps to Zuko and Iroh talking in the bedroom. This kind of ties back to the animation in many ways. Firstly, the comment on the light being a celestial glimmer is almost identical to what Iroh says to Zuko. The main difference is this live action conversation is happening after the beam, whereas during the animation it happens when they first see the beam. One other thing the live action does differently here though is it goes a bit deeper into the conversation. It doesn't quite have the classic line about honor from Zuko, instead the live action makes it about returning home in glory, and it has Zuko saying, "It's my destiny." Going back to the Southern Water Tribe, the way Aang wakes up in the live action is very similar to the animation. Even the facial expressions aren't far off. We then proceed to see him go outside, play with the kids for a bit, and you then get the introduction between Aang and Sokka, because at this point in the live action, Sokka doesn't even know Aang's name, as opposed to the animation where by this point they've exchanged names and then Aang kind of passed out when they're travelling back on Upper, and that's how he gets back to the Southern Water Tribe. Here, Aang's a bit more confused. However, the way he says his name, "I'm Aang," is exactly the same way he said it in the animation.
"I'm Aang. I'm Aang."
The next thing that happens is that Aang realizes Upper isn't there. Aang asks, "Where is his sky bison?" This is where Sokka doesn't believe or even understand what a sky bison is. It's kind of similar to the animation, although the animation was more about Sokka not believing Upper could fly. Here it's more about him not really knowing what Aang means by a sky bison. The bison whistle is interesting as well. It's not something we've had in the animation till much later, but here in the live action there's a bit more story behind why Aang's got it so early on, which we'll get to in a later episode. Also, the way Aang demonstrates his airbending in the live action is a little different to the animation. In the animation he's showing them his airbending using his glider, but here in the live action he's airbending up into the sky to try and find Upper. The next part of episode 1 is way different to the animation. It's basically all exposition with Gran just talking through essentially everything the animation showed in the scenes leading up to and during Aang and Katara going into the abandoned Fire Nation ship. On top of that, she pretty much repeats the animation intro that Katara says in the original animation. And when I say repeat, it is pretty much word for word. So that might be another reason why in the live action intro they kind of changed it up just a little bit. The live action Gran also reveals that Aang has been frozen for 100 years. This is different to the animation, as you'll know, because Aang and Katara didn't work that out until they were together on the Fire Nation ship. And just to take the exposition a little bit further, Gran says Aang is the last airbender, something the Southern Water Tribe members kind of knew in the animation, but not for sure. Also, interestingly, I went back and checked it. In the animation, Zuko is the first person to say Aang is the last airbender, so they've essentially given Zuko's line to Gran here. We then get to see a bit of confrontation between Zuko and his crew. This isn't in the animation in episode 1, but there is a similar kind of scenario later in the animation, and the live action here is kind of setting up something for a later episode, which we might get to eventually. Going back to Aang, We see him realize everyone he knew is gone after what Gran said. Again, not something he openly said or believed in the animation until a little bit later on. We then see Katara talk to Aang about what happened when the Fire Nation attacked. This is where she explains how her father left with the other warriors to hunt down the Firebenders. If you remember, I said at the beginning they removed that intro part. This is kind of where they start to cover more of that story. We then see Zuko doing his practices, which are fairly similar to the animation, although it feels like in this live action, Iroh doesn't coach him as much as he did in the animation. It therefore means that there's no ask from Zuko for Iroh to teach in the advanced set. Also, Zuko's practicing solo, unlike the animation where he was against 2 of his crew. The reason he's practicing is the same though, he's doing it to prepare to capture the Avatar. And in the live action there's a cool quote about Avatar Kyoshi. Now the next part's also a slight change in the lore. When they go up to the Fire Nation ship that's been marooned there, Katara says no one comes here, but they do still end up inside. In the animation it's a bit more extreme. She tells Aang that they're not allowed to go in there and that it might be booby-trapped. Also, they get there because they were riding on top of penguins, also known as penguin sledding. You see they get there slightly differently in the live action here. You can see their footprints, which means they've just walked up to the Fire Nation ship. The next part is a nice match though, when Aang says,
You're a waterbender.
to Katara, and he does it in a very similar way to the way Aang did it in the animation. One other thing I'll throw out here is in the live action, Aang doesn't suggest Katara goes to find a waterbending master in the Northern Water Tribe, compared to the animation where it actually is Aang's suggestion to go to the Northern Water Tribe. Another slight difference is the type of bending advice Aang gives Katara. In the live action, it's about finding balance and feeling the energy. In the animation, his advice is if you want to be a bender, you have to let go of fear. We then see Zuko arrive in his Fire Nation ship. It's a little different in that Aang is already there and he gets taken by Katara to hide. Before that, Gran drops another spoiler. She says to everyone that Aang is the Avatar, something that was done a little bit more dramatically in the animation when Zuko calls Aang the Avatar, and that then surprises Katara and Sokka in a different way. When Zuko does arrive, he does a bit more of an intro in the live action, but ultimately it's the same as the animation, where he's basically saying he's looking for the Avatar. We also see Sokka grab his symbolic club in the live action, slightly different to the animation where he already had it in his hand when Zuko had arrived. We then see Sokka confront Zuko and they have a bit of a mini Agni Kai. The live action is different here in that Zuko makes it about his glory compared to him restoring his honor. However, much like the animation, Zuko wins the fight very easily and Sokka ends up on the ground, and this is where Aang turns up, albeit not on top of a penguin. The timing is about the same though, it's just as Zuko is about to hit Sokka with a ball of fire. Continuing with the theme of the animation, the live action has Aang take them all out. But even though he's winning, the reason for Aang going with Zuko is also very similar to the animation. Zuko threatens to burn down the village, so Aang gives himself up as long as he doesn't hurt the villagers. One thing Aang doesn't say in the live action though is asking Katara and Sokka to take care of Appa for him, which feels a bit of a miss because you would think Aang would have Appa on his mind. Instead, in the live action, he simply calls Sokka the bravest person he's ever met. As Aang's taken to Zuko's ship and they sail off, we see Katara trying to convince Sokka that they need to go after him and save Aang. It's very similar to how they do it in the animation, although in the animation there is an interesting bit of Katang foreshadowing where Sokka says, "We're going to save your boyfriend." Obviously Katara says he's not my boyfriend, but in the live action he doesn't say that. Instead, he says let's go save that weird kid. So no Katang foreshadowing just yet in the live action. In terms of how they catch up Zuko, there's a nice little tie-in between the live action and animation again, because they decide to go on Appa, and the fact that Sokka's reluctant in the live action also matches very nicely with the animation. Back on board Zuko's ship, the imprisonment part is a little bit different. In the animation, Aang manages to escape before he ends up in a cell, but you see in the live action, he actually gets put in the cell and he escapes by sneakily stealing the guard's keys. I also like that Aang was able to have a conversation with Iroh in the live action, something that didn't happen in the animation. In the escape part, we see Aang trying to glide away, and as he falls, he gets saved by Sokka. In the animation, he actually falls into the water, not on his glider by the way. This then triggers the Avatar state, and you then get that iconic Avatar state music as he water bends out of the water, and the rest is history. None of that happened in the live action though. Instead, Sokka saves Aang and pulls him up to Appa, and then just like the animation, Zuko sends a fireball towards them, There's a bit of a change here because Katara is the one that blocks the fireball. In the animation, it was actually Aang that turned around and blocked the fireball. So here they've given Katara more of a moment than Aang. Now I assume it's because Katara didn't get her moment earlier, because in the animation, Sokka and Katara actually landed on the ship and they got out, and Katara had a bit of a waterbending moment to stop the guards. As they didn't do that in the live action, I imagine that's why they gave Katara her waterbending moment here. The slight thing with Aang not going into the Avatar state, though, means the perception of Aang is slightly different. In the animation, because Aang went into the Avatar state, Zuko saw him as deceptively powerful and he was cautious of him. It also meant Katara was kind of in awe of how Aang displayed his powers. That's not quite the same case now in the live action, because Zuko hasn't really witnessed Aang's powers just yet. Not to the extent of the Avatar state. It also means Katara hasn't witnessed Aang waterbending. Something you'll notice doesn't really happen in season 1 of the live action at all. However, fear not, because we're moving towards the latter part of the episode, and not all is lost with the Avatar state. Before we get to the Southern Air Temple, the motivation part is also very different. In the animation, it's about getting Aang to the Northern Water Tribe. In the live action, it's more about them not being able to go back to the Southern Water Tribe because it would put their family in danger. Which is true, to be fair, for the animation, it's just not something they really call out. Another difference is that in the animation, Aang has a fun plan that he's put together on a map. That's not really something they've got in the live action either. Ultimately though, this leads them to the Southern Air Temple, where they squeeze a 23-minute animated episode into about 8 minutes of live action. Of course, that means some significant differences. The live action jumps straight into showing the devastation from the Fire Nation attack, and the remnants of the Fire Nation soldiers. Something in the animation, Sokka and Katara spent about half the episode trying to hide from Aang. There's no thinking airbenders are alive here in the live action. There's also no airball match between Aang and Sokka. The live action doesn't have a Gyatso statue either, like the animation does. Plus, as I mentioned earlier, there's no air temple sanctuary with statues of the past Avatar in. One of the new things in the live action is that the shrines and statues are a little bit more individual to locations, and they're more important because Aang uses them to speak to past avatars. The concept is very slightly different in the animation. Also, no Momo in the live action at this stage, instead it jumps straight to Aang finding Gyatso's dead skeleton. It's actually a very close replica of how it looks in the animation. If you look closely, you can see they've even got the tears to the clothing in the right place, plus that symbolic medallion. The key difference is you don't see a pile of dead firebenders, which I know some people aren't happy with, because the animation made it seem like Gyatso took a lot of firebenders with him when he died. In terms of reaction though, Aang's reaction to seeing Gyatso dead on the floor is very similar. You don't see him dropping to the ground, but you do see the tears and the pain in his face and how sad he is at losing Gyatso, and that's exactly when he loses control and enters the Avatar state. Interestingly, it seems Gyatso's memory and his words to Aang is what calms him down out of the Avatar state, as opposed to the animation where it's more Katara that calms him down. The next part where he calms down and drops to the ground and Katara gives him a hug, again, is very similar between the live action and the animation. One interesting thing about the live action though, which I've been trying to preach about a lot, is that this is pretty much the only time Katara hugs or even touches Aang in pretty much the whole of season 1, which is weird given Katara's character is normally a very touchy-feely character and she loves to give Aang and the people she cares about a hug. But that's not really portrayed as much, at least not in season 1 of the live action series. Another thing that's missing is that Aang doesn't say the line, "I really am the last airbender," which I always really liked in the original and I feel like is a bit of a miss in the live action. Although having said that, Gran kind of already said it, so I guess they felt they didn't need to say it again. Ultimately though, that kind of brings us to the end of the episode, and finally Aang picks up on his mission that the monks wanted to send him on. He says it's basically his duty to go and learn the other disciplines and become the Avatar. To which Sokka's response is absolutely hilarious, and to be fair to Sokka, his comedic timing in season 1 is not far off perfection. The final moment we see Zuko putting Aang's poster on his research board as well, which of course is new because it wasn't in the animation. And there you have it, that pretty much rounds out episode 1 for all the similarities and differences. I know you might be thinking Momo's not here, and also one of my favourite music pieces from Avatar, Into a Nighttime Sky, isn't here, but you are right, that iconic music as they're flying away from the Southern Air Temple sadly isn't in this series at all. So hopefully this has given you a good picture of the similarities and differences. You can certainly see episode 1 of the live action encompasses a good 3 episodes of the animation, and I've done my best to cover as much detail as possible, but if you notice anything else that you'd like to pull out, let me know in the comments down below. You can really see from this video though, that even though they haven't got everything in the same order, there isn't that much that they've missed out on. It's more just the way they delivered it, and the way they've kind of retweaked it and reordered things. That's kind of one of the key differences. I know this was a long one, but it's about as much detail as I could go into. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you later.